So I want to start with a quick quote. Quote is, and this is one developed internally by one of our resilience engineers, is building tomorrow's tool today is the most strategic return on investment. And this kind of really captures uh, the mindset of what's been going on at NCDOT over the last 4 years. Is they've really been focusing on the future. What can we do? What can we build now? What data can we produce now to prepare ourselves for the future so that we are in a much better place when the next event happens? But to know where we are now, we have to kind of go back a little bit to see how far have we come. So we're going to time travel back to exactly 4 years ago last week. Does it seem like it's already been only been 4 years since Hurricane Florence? It kind of still seems like it was last week, and it kind of was last week, but yet 4 years ago. So looking back where we were back then, during the hurricane, as it was making landfall, there was a press briefing that happened at the JFHQ. I hope you may have even been present for that one. And someone in the media asked then DOT Secretary Trogdon if he knew what the flood impacts and durations would be on certain roads. What roads do they expect to be flooded and for how long? And he did not have a good answer. He didn't have really an answer at all for that, which triggered a whole series of events following that. The hydraulics unit within NCDOT is the part of NCDOT that's charged with looking at all that information, doing the hydraulic studies, making sure we've got good culvert conveyance, bridges, and all that stuff. Working with the different parts of DOT to make sure that everything is ready to go, and our transportation network is going to be resilient and resistant to floods, and water will flow properly. Well, this was the first event that the hydraulics unit was really brought in to help with emergency response. They had never been tasked with an actual response role prior to Hurricane Florence. So the call came out following this press press briefing, and the task was given to the hydraulics unit saying, "Hey, we need to know the answer to these questions." And that's when the call rang out. I think that press briefing happened on a Friday or a Saturday. Sunday, the call came out. DOT called us, parts of other partners at other firms, other parts of DOT, and it's Sunday, September 16th, 2018, and this is what everybody's doing. This is what we call it the war room. You can see it's not real fancy. There was a lot of reactive work happening, a lot of real-time analysis. We were pulling in literally every piece of data, excuse me, every piece of data that we could find to try to help solve the problem of, okay, what's going to happen? What roads are going to flood? Where do we need to send the public? And you can see that this is a kind of half chaotic scene. And this, again, it's on the weekend, and the storm is still happening. So people were braving the hurricane just to get to these facilities. So this is where resilience started within DOT's hydraulics unit following the storm. So what did we come up with? Well, after all that analysis, all that work, this was the answer that we gave to the DOT secretary. Basically, if you're in this yellow area, don't go there. That's just a no-go zone. Not a great answer. Pretty broad overall, and not, doesn't really tell anybody anything other than just don't go here. So the biggest thing that the biggest issue that we encountered back then was, North Carolina is a great state for data. We have a lot of data that's available to us. The state has taken a lot of effort over the last few years, or the last 20 years really, to develop amazing statewide data sets. But at the time, that data was kind of dispersed. There's some great data at this agency. There's some other great data at that agency. The university system has some of this data. Emergency management has that data. DOT has some other data. It's all great, but it's all scattered to the winds. And when you're in a rapid scenario where you need to react quickly and look at a lot of different data sets, at the time it was difficult to use. We couldn't really leverage a lot of that great data because we didn't have time to try to find it and pull it all together. So after the storm, we kind of had a bit of a come to terms with what happened, and we started really taking stock with DOT of how do we move forward. And I love this quote from Henry Ford: "The only real mistake is the one from which we learn nothing." Not saying anyone committed a mistake during the storm. It really caught everybody off guard with how bad it was going to be. But the important thing is that we learned a great deal from it. So after the storm came through, now we're in recovery mode. Now we're trying to take in the data and figure out how we move forward from this point. This is the famous picture that everybody saw of I-40 turning into a river. This was the information that started coming in once the hurricane passed. So we started being able to leverage that immediate post-storm data and figure out what exactly are we dealing with. So following the storm, in the weeks that followed, the governor was actually Governor Cooper was giving a press briefing. Amazing how a lot of things start with press briefings these days. Either government officials not having a good answer or government officials having an answer, and then we have to act on them. Well, this was a case where the governor was giving a press briefing. I think he had visited Wilmington, which obviously was cut off famously during the storm. And I-40 obviously was a big issue, being that it flooded for over a week. And the governor made a statement during a press conference that he was going to make sure that steps were taken that I-40 would never flood again. And kind of everybody who was listening to that conversation, a lot of hydraulic engineers and transportation engineers, kind of their jaws hit the floor, behind the scenes when that statement was made, because that's a very bold statement. But what it means is, y'all, you got work to do. So what followed that was DOT kicked off a flood resilience feasibility study for I-95 and I-40. This was for sections of basically where I-40 and I-95 meet, which is right around Benson, North Carolina. If you look at the map, we looked at every point along I-95 south of that meeting point to the border with South Carolina, and points along I-40 from that meeting point all the way into Wilmington. So, about 81 miles on South Carolina on I-95 and just shy of 90 miles on I-40. Then we also added some connectors. Basically, the point of this study was to determine what design improvements need to be made along each of these major interstates at the points of greatest flood risk to ensure that those areas of the highway are more resilient, and we can keep the highways open and maintain connectivity and mobility across those roads. And this was kind of a really big deal at the time because it brought together parts of DOT, different agencies, different units within the Department of Transportation that don't typically work together on a day-to-day basis. Everybody thinks DOT, well, it's just one agency. Well, it's the largest state agency in this North Carolina state government. There's many different divisions and units and piece parts to that agency. And a lot of them started coming together. We had the Secretary's Office, hydraulics unit. I'm not going to name all these. You can see on the screen, but a lot of different units, as well as the affected DOT divisions 3, 4, and 6. We got them all together and brought everybody to the table and said, okay, show us where the highway flooded. What were the major flood areas? And the graphic here is actually what one of the divisions gave us. They gave us a big laminated map of their division, and every one of those little marked up areas was an area that they noted flooding, and they even were so kind as to measure how deep it was and tell us how deep was the flooding in each of these spots. So it was immensely helpful going down to that local DOT division level and getting that local knowledge from them to be able to put into this plan. So what we looked at were a few different factors. First off, we had to assess the vulnerabilities. Where did it flood? What happened? We had, like I said, we talked to the divisions. We went out in the field with the divisions, had them walk us to the bridges and the culverts and show us where the flooding happened and take stock of that. From that point on, we started looking at what the resilience criteria were. So what was the metric we were going to try to meet? Is this the the elevation that Hurricane Florence or Hurricane Matthew, because Matthew kind of affected I-95 a lot worse than Florence did, even though Florence affected I-95 pretty badly too. Matthew obviously had just happened a couple of years prior and was a similar scale storm. So we looked at both of them. So we started looking at, well, what is the higher elevation? Is it the flood elevation from one of those hurricanes? Is it the 100-year flood elevation that is determined from North Carolina Emergency Management? Or is it, a certain amount of freeboard, maybe adding 1.5 feet or 2 feet to the roadbed, raising the highway up just a couple of feet? What is greater? And what's going to provide the most return on investment? And then we started looking at what improvement options could we make to the highway to achieve those resilience metrics, whether it's elevating the road, do we need to put bigger culverts, bigger pipes, allow for greater conveyance? Do we need to build bridges? What kind of improvements do we look at? And we looked at a lot. Each improvement, I think we looked at something like 60 or 70 different types of roadway improvements for each of these areas that flooded, and then had to determine what was the most feasible. Again, this is a feasibility study. So what's feasible by cost and labor effort to do the work. And all of this kind of resulted in about 1,000+ page report that we put together with NCDOT. Now, from a GIS perspective, that doesn't mean squat to anybody. All y'all are sitting there thinking, oh, great, a report. Awesome. Wow. We had some graphics in there too. Well, okay, cool. What does this have to do with making a digital solution? Well, that's where this operation dashboard came into place. This was something that DOT didn't ask us to do. We kind of got the idea after, a bunch of us geospatial folks started looking at the report and realized that, the engineers put together this 1,000+ page report, which is great, and they're really proud of. But most folks aren't going to read a 1,000-page report. So we decided, let's try putting it together into putting all the important stuff into an operations dashboard. So that's what we did. We took all of the different routes that were analyzed as part of the analysis, which you kind of see up at the top. I don't have a laser pointer ability, so I'll just have to assume y'all follow along with me here. So we have all the different routes listed up at the top along the top banner. And then along the side, you've got the different mile marker areas, the places where the road flooded. So we're looking at the example here is I-95. All the red dots are the places that flooded. And then in the bottom left, you see the different improvements that were made that were suggested at the time. So each one of those, if you select a flood area, you'll see the improvement down in the bottom left that was selected as the most feasible. And then along the right side of the dashboard, all the different cost numbers change. So it's really easy for someone, at executive level to come through and just kind of skim their way through and look at individual places and say, okay, this is what I want to look at. What did you choose and what's it going to cost? And we put all that information into the dashboard. We included the cost sheet PDFs, the design improvement roll sheet, the big microstation document. It's like 6 feet long. for each of these. We included that in the dashboard. So it's a very comprehensive dashboard. It's got gigabytes worth of data in it because there's tons of pages. But now, instead of having to filter through 1,000-page PDF, somebody can just go to a website and quickly filter through this. And the DOT secretary loved it so much that he just said, "Give me the URL. I don't want to see the report." So the DOT secretary just started using the dashboard rather than reading the report. Now we still have a link to the report up in the top right. There's a little hamburger menu. If you were to select that, you can download the entire report from there, so people can still get their big 1,000-page PDF. But this showed, that the GIS really made life a little bit easier for everybody trying to digest the solution that was come up with. So that was kind of the starting point, looking at the flood resiliency feasibility study. That was the start. From that point on, DOT started saying, okay, now we know areas that flood. We've got some momentum on that side. Now we need to start looking at awareness. Where are the areas? These are we looked at the places that we know flood along these major highways. What about the rest of the state? What don't we know? So ever since then, DOT has really been embarking on this, looking at what don't we know, trying to find the gaps in our knowledge and try to better understand them. So, again, we kind of go back to the fact that North Carolina is a very data-rich state. All these different data sets that are available, we have statewide flood information from the mapping program. We've got statewide LIDAR. We've got tons of hydraulic models and field survey. The DOT has a statewide asset inventory that they pulled together in the last few years. So we've got all this great data. Let's start putting it together and seeing what conclusions can we actually draw from that data itself. So one of the big efforts that we undertook with them was analyzing roadway inundation statewide. So I mentioned before the state floodplain mapping program, they have mapped the entire state. We have floodplains for the entire state. And for most of the state, we also know what the flooding is going to be at multiple return periods or recurrence intervals. Most people just think of the 100-year flood, but we actually, for the majority of the state, can also tell you what the 10-year, the 25-year, the 50-year, and the 500-year flood are going to be as well. We have those elevations. So we started looking at that from a statewide perspective. What roads would be impacted at each of those crossings? And what would the overall result be from that? So we started putting together this solution. So we looked at the entire state. We looked at everywhere that a state road, whether it's secondary or primary, crossed a studied stream, a stream that had been studied by the state floodplain mapping program. And obviously we looked at all 5 of the recurrence intervals for their flood elevation where they were available. And then we clipped the roads to those extents. So we got this little red section. This is the part of the road that is covered by the floodplain. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that whole section of road is necessarily flooded. We didn't want to just stop there and say, okay, well, this is the section of the road that's impacted by the floodplain. This is the part that's at risk. Yes, this is the part of the road that's potentially at risk, but there's other factors involved. So we had some different data that we pulled in to analyze this. We looked at the statewide LRS road network. That was our source for all the road center lines. Then we also used the statewide LIDAR available from NCEM. And actually NCEM had pulled together during Florence a full statewide DEM. You can see it in the left image, which they said this is the LIDAR for the roads itself. So there's a digital elevation model that exists just for the roads themselves, which is great. That has been an immensely powerful data set over the last 4 years. Amazing data set. We also have multi-frequency water surface elevation rasters, those different recurrence intervals that we get from the state, as well as the floodplain boundaries on the mapping program. Now, the reason why I said, just because that section of road intersects the floodplain means it's potentially at risk, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's all flooded. This graphic kind of illustrates that. The road elevation is going to change. It's not a perfectly flat road. Now, this is a slightly more exaggerated graphic, but it does a great job of showing that, the road is going to move up and down, and the recurrence intervals are going to move up and down as well. So parts of the road may be more impacted more impacted sooner than other parts of the road where you have a road crossing, which is why we decided to go with a point-based approach when we displayed the data. So we divided those road crossings up into 50-foot intervals and dropped a point there. And that's where we took our elevations. So at the end of the day, when we got this all finished up, the analysis was all done, we analyzed well over 15,000 linear miles of road, over 1.5 million individual data points were analyzed. It comes out to about 10% of the whole statewide road network is at some risk of flooding. And then there's other risk areas that we haven't looked at yet. There's areas where we have known flood risk, but we don't yet have good road LIDAR because the road was built, after the most recent statewide LIDAR was collected. So there's still some gaps that can still be filled. And this was kind of what we delivered. A lot of what I've already said. What we did also put together was we included evacuation routes and specific callouts for the strategic transportation corridors within the state. And this has also been put into an application that was hosted in AWS. I'm going to start speeding up a little bit because I'm going over, but I wanted to kind of cover this pretty heavily. So this is the final application. It's hosted in Amazon Cloud, and it allows you to go through and select the individual recurrence interval that you're interested in. You can select by county, by DOT division. You can also select by an individual route if you just want to see, like, okay, what does US 64 look like across the entire state? You can do that. And then it gives you the inundation metrics over on the right side. It breaks everything down by depth category. The darker the color, the deeper the water. And then you have the ability to come through and filter that data down a little bit more. You can select individual areas, do a clip and ship. So if I only care about a specific neighborhood or a specific area of interest, I can select just those areas, get the inundation metrics for those. I can export out. We can export out different outputs. We can do a CSV. I can get a KML of these points, pull it into Google Earth and play with it even more. And we can even print a little report out of here that gives you a little PDF snippet map, as well as a printout of your inundation metrics. And DOT has been using this quite frequently because what this does, even though this is not a real-time tool, so some of y'all are familiar with tools like Feynman, which look at real-time metrics from gauges, which is great. This is not real-time. This is more of a planning level tool that helps fill in the gaps statewide. So we can look at any point in the state and get a sense of what could happen during a specific event. And that's been immensely powerful for DOT. On the same side of that, we also produced a similar data set we call CRIS. It's the Coastal Roadway Inundation Simulator. Same concept, different flood source. So instead of looking at the individual recurrence intervals, the maps flood hazards from the statewide flood mapping program, we looked at the coastal counties only and looked at potential coastal inundation. So we actually analyzed the road network up to 35 feet of inundation, which is absurd. It is the statistical maximum, but on the web platform we put together, we only show up to 17 feet of surge. And it gives you the same kind of information that the roadway inundation tool does. It's just based off of coastal inundation. As you can see, we've got a little slider bar that you can go up and down with and select the level of inundation. And it gives you the same type metrics. It has the same functionality built into it as our RIP tool. Again, it's just looking at coastal surge and coastal inundation rather than riverine flooding. So if you've got something like a predicted king tide coming into New Hanover County, for instance, that's going to be 4.5 feet. Well, you can come in here and look at what 4 feet of inundation looks like and what 5 feet of inundation looks like, and get your prepare for that. You can know what roads are probably going to be underwater based on that particular event. We've also embedded, I'm not going to cover it too much because it's not really well baked yet, but we do have a Hindcast module built into our coastal tool, where we go in and can look at the actual flooding results from certain hurricanes. So we can look at hurricanes Florence and Matthew, Dorian, and also Isaias. It's not really baked all that well. It's kind of a beta format right now, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But one thing I will touch on really quickly that we put together is our Hindcast risk rating. So what we've done is, this is a concept we've come up with NCDOT of trying to determine, based on actual flooding from actual storms, which sections of road are at the most risk of flooding. So basically what we've done is we've looked at, okay, how many times do each of these sections of road get inundated by a storm? And then to what level of depth did they get inundated? So essentially, if I have a section of road that has a rating of 3-2, that means that section of road was impacted by 3 out of the 4 storms that we analyzed, and up to a depth category of 2, which in this case would be up to 3 feet deep. So 3 storms impacted that part of the road, and it was almost up to 3 feet deep in both of those areas. So that's a pretty high risk. So that would be on this graph, bright red. So these would help DOT understand what are the areas of road that flood most frequently during an event, and to what level of severity. So they can start using this to maybe prioritize resilience and changes in the future. So pulling all this stuff together, we've built several different tools. There's some other ones that we've put together with them that I don't have in this presentation, but there's a lot of different tools that have been put together, not only by us, but by other industry partners as well. Other firms have put together some amazing tools as well. And they all have to be pulled together somehow. How do we make it easy? Again, we just talked about during the hurricane, we had all this great data, but it was scattered to the winds. How did we fix that? So what we did was we put together this website called RAFT. It stands for Resilience Analysis Framework for Transportation. Basically what this is a cloud-hosted website that just gives everybody access to all the different resilience tools that have been built. It's still in kind of an early form. We're still loading applications into it, and we're actually in the process of migrating this website over to the NC emergency management side of things. So they're going to actually put this site behind their firewall, so it'll be available to state government. But it basically just allows everybody the opportunity to go into one-stop shop, get all the tools you need, and put it all together, and not have to remember a whole bunch of different URLs or remember who has what. It's just go to this website, find the tool you need, and you can open it. So why did we do all this? Again, the hurricanes, both Florence and Matthew, they kind of caught us with our pants down a little bit. They exposed a lot of fundamental gaps in our understanding of the road network. We didn't really know exactly what would happen to the roads, besides a certain few problem children like NC12 and others. We didn't really know what would happen. So that really hit home. And the fact that we had all this great data, but in the heat of the moment, we couldn't really use a lot of it to the full extent that it was meant to be used. So pulling all these digital solutions together, making it easy to draw conclusions, get everything, get everything in one-stop shop has really been the point of all this, is get all that great data, do all this gap analysis, get all the information that we could possibly pull together and stick it somewhere where it's really easy for everybody to use. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the partnerships that made all of this possible. It's not just, not just my firm as a whole. NCDOT and NCEM have forged a great partnership at the state level. And it's through that partnership that every last bit of this work has been possible. The level of cooperation and data sharing that's been going on between those two state agencies has been paramount in all of this. And also, I have to recognize other industry colleagues, other firms, ESP Associates, Dewberry, AECOM, others, Atkins, they also work with NCDOT Hydraulics on all these resilience applications. They all have built great tools in themselves that we're hoping to continue to work. There's a great term that was coined by John Dorman back when he was in the state flipping that program called co-opetition. And that kind of really embodies what we're doing with NCDOT as a bunch of collective firms. Is yes, we're competitors, but at the same time, for the good of the program, for the good of the state, we all work together really well towards a common goal. And that's been what's really been happening over the last 5 years with NCDOT is bringing everybody together and understanding what's possible. And these are our future plans. We've got a couple things that are happening right now. We're making some upgrades. Everything's hopefully getting ready to move over to a .gov site. And we're going to be making some upgrades to the RIT tool in the short term. So these are very much living tools. I'm sure this list is going to grow over time as we move past another hurricane season. So keep looking for more updates in the future, because these things are just going to keep getting better and better. And with that, I think we got maybe like 1 minute for questions if anybody's got any.
Thank you, Garrett.